I want to go to two guys who are up to their eyeballs in this law, who have been fighting for freedom, who have been with the truckers since the convoy began. I'm talking about Keith Wilson, lawyer for the truckers in Ottawa, and our friend Chad Williamson, lawyer for the truckers down in Coots, Alberta, both of which are referenced in this ruling. May I introduce you, the legal dream team? Chad Williamson and Keith Wilson. Great to see you, fellas. Thank you so much for joining this emergency live stream. Boy, we got a lot of brain power on the show now. Thank God you guys have come to help out. How are you guys doing? Chad, how are you doing down there in Calgary?
Doing awesome, Ezra. Cam, I'm so busy with other matters. I had Marty, as you folks might know, is one of the guys that's worked with me on some of the crazier files that we've done, like storm into my office at 11 o'clock this morning saying, hey, did you see the new federal court decision? So I've just been trying to digest everything, as I imagine Keith has already had the opportunity to do, being a couple hours ahead of us out in Ottawa. But yeah, doing great. What outstanding news, and just another dagger into the heart of the beast.
Yeah, well, that's incredible. Well, thank you. And you were down there at that border saloon in Coots, Alberta, observing the blockade firsthand, a peaceful blockade, not one of serious violence, to use the wording of the law. Keith Wilson, I'm not sure if you're in Edmonton today or in Ottawa. You've been between those two cities quite a lot over the last 2 years. You are a lawyer, not just for Tamara Lich, but you were the interlocutor. You were the negotiator out in Ottawa. Tell me first your reaction to this ruling. I'm pleasantly surprised. I didn't think they had a hope. I mean, so many court rulings have gone against freedom over the last 2 years. I'm frankly stunned by this, and I think the Liberals were too. Let me ask you that first. Did you expect this, or was this just a hope too far to hope?
I actually was holding out hope. I'm here in my office in Edmonton, and I have said many times when people were expressing dismay about the Rouleau ruling from the public inquiry and the commission inquiry that Justice Rouleau led, that I was like, I thought it was political theater. It became pretty clear that's what it was near the end. And I was holding out hope that the court would apply the facts to the law and conclude the obvious, which is the legal test for the invocation wasn't met. The Coots border was opened on the weekend in that February of 2022. The Windsor and all the other blockades were cleared. On the Saturday and Sunday, the trucker leadership in Ottawa had negotiated a deal with the mayor of Ottawa to relocate the trucks out of the residential areas and consolidate them up onto Wellington in front of the Prime Minister's office and the Parliament buildings to give the protest longer staying power. And so there was no justification. There was no crisis. There was no insurrection. There was no interference with international trade. None of the legal tests were met. And the court has confirmed that that is in fact the case. The legal test wasn't met, but it's went a step further, and this is great cause for hope, is the federal court has said that charter rights were violated. So even if they met the test to invoke, which they didn't, the charter rights were violated. Section 8 in particular, you're right, against unlawful search and seizure, relating specifically to the outrageous tyrannical act of freezing hundreds of Canadians' bank accounts and canceling their credit cards.
You know, Chrystia Freeland was twitching more than she normally does when she was in front of the mic today. And because she, as much as anyone, was the public face of the martial law. Yeah, Marco Mendocino, but we learned from the Public Order Inquiry Commission that he was just a useful idiot. He wasn't even fully briefed by his own staff. It was Chrystia Freeland that was contacting the banks and saying, seize that account, seize this account. I want to ask you one more thing before we go back to Chad for a second. Keith, I know you were negotiating literally day by day, even hour by hour, out there in Ottawa with the Ottawa police. And I want you to say again what you've told me before, which is that you were in full communication, open communication with the city and with the Ottawa police, managing the convoy, keeping lanes open, moving away from residential areas, moving these trucks over there and these trucks over there. It was cooperative. There was some tension for sure, but it was a relationship building on trust, and you were sort of the official negotiator. Now, I want you to say it in your own words because I don't want to get a word wrong, But I believe you've told me that there was a deal. There was a deal between the truckers and the city of Ottawa, and instead of ratifying that deal, Justin Trudeau pulled the trigger on martial law because he didn't want there to be a deal, because he wanted that drama teacher, drama move. You and the truckers in Ottawa actually were in full compliance with everything that police wanted, but Trudeau was worried he was going to lose his moment, so he invoked martial law right when you guys had a deal. Can you tell me if I got that right and fill in any gaps if I got it wrong?
Sure, that's absolutely what happened. We had the deal on the Saturday. It was publicly announced on the Sunday. We implemented the deal with the cooperation of the city police. You can see footage out there where the trucks are being escorted by police with flashing lights up onto Wellington. And we cleared 2 city blocks on the Monday, moved 123 vehicles out in the residential type areas of downtown. And I was in constant communication with the mayor's chief of staff and the city manager, Steve Kanellakis. And I still remember on the Tuesday, we got stopped due to miscommunication with the police because they had to move barricades, and we're about to move trucks again. And they apologized for it. All of my text messages have been used in evidence, both in the criminal trial for Chris and Tamara, as well as in the public inquiry. But the most crucial moment was on the Wednesday morning after the invocation of the Emergencies Act. We were ready to move trucks again, and I got a phone call from Steve Kanellakis, the city manager for the city of Ottawa, and he confirmed what I'm about to say in his testimony before the public inquiry. His tone was so sorrowful and sad, and he's like, Keith, we gave it our best shot, but the federal government doesn't want this to happen. They're blocking any further moves. So Trudeau had figured out what we were doing in terms of de-escalating. The mayor's position was, he communicated to us that he said, if you move up into Wellington and consolidate up there, I don't care if you stay there for months, because that's where your grievance is with the federal government. So that was our move. The federal government, the Trudeau Liberals, wanted to send a message to Canadians, Ezra, that don't you dare challenge us. You'll regret it.
Yeah, I think you're so right. Now, Chad, I want to bring you in here because you have a similar story, I think. And again, I'm relying on you to correct me, because you were the guy down there at the Coots blockade. You and your partners sort of did rotating shifts. And what Keith was doing out in Ottawa, you were that same liaison with the RCMP down there in Coots. And I'm really glad you were. First of all, I'd like you to confirm for me that there was no violence whatsoever. And in fact, your advice to the truckers was always keep it lawful, guys, civil disobedience, nothing more rambunctious. But suddenly, I remember it was the day before the invocation of the martial law, you correct me if my memory's wrong, that the Mounties had a big press release. We found some shotguns and some hunting rifles, not in the saloon, but we found them somewhere else, and they laid them out in a beautiful photo op. And I looked at it, I said, that's probably scary to city slickers in Toronto or Vancouver or Ottawa, but that's just sort of regular for down there in Coots. Like, that's hunting, that's duck hunting, and frankly, it's sort of weird if you don't have a gun if you're down in Coots. I take what Keith just said in Ottawa and that RCMP photo op as the Liberals' panicky attempt to rebrand a completely peaceful movement, both in Ottawa and in Coots, to rebrand it as, quote, serious violence. That's the language I just quoted from the Emergencies Act. That's the language this judge was leaning on. They needed evidence of, quote, serious violence. They had none, so they broke off the peace deal in Ottawa and trumped up, we found a shotgun, guys. That'll scare you Toronto Liberals. Chad, what was it? Was that the feeling you had there in Coots?
Look, Ezra, so this is going to be a little bit more difficult for me than it might be for Keith. As you know, there's the proceedings against who are kind of collectively known as the Coots Four. Now, these are the gents who were charged with, among other things, conspiracy to commit murder. Obviously, they're the subject of these these alleged gun charges. That's currently before the court. We don't represent them, and unfortunately, my knowledge in respect of that particular case is really quite limited. Now, as you also might know, there's three other gentlemen, colloquially known as the Coots Three, who are the alleged organizers of the Coots blockade. Now, this is also coming before the courts in a 3-week jury trial coming up later this spring, and we've got another pre-trial applications to be heard close to the end of February on this. So these issues are before the courts now. Now, my role down in Coots, I'm okay to acknowledge that we were there to provide your standard criminal and charter advice to anybody on the ground, piecemeal as they'd come. So the way that we always looked at it is there'd be a retainer when someone came up to ask us for a question. That retainer ended after the provision of summary advice, and obviously those legal services were crowdfunded. Now, we did assist and observe some of the negotiations. Again, that was whether that was me or whether that was Martin. It just depends on the timing. What I will say is everything, at least from kind of an outsider perspective after the fact, because I was not down there at the moment when the guns were alleged to have been discovered in I suppose a trailer, but it smacked to me, Ezra, that this was politically motivated. We know that Jason Kenney was getting a lot of pushback from the grassroots conservative movement in rural Alberta. And what we've seen, at least, and while this might be anecdotal, in other cases, and we've run a ton of these cases, whether it's the COVID kind of restaurant rebellion cases and the lockdowns, looking at even Minister Guilbeault blocking Rebel News on Twitter, it's become very apparent to me that so many of these government decisions are almost wholly politically motivated, and what's even more interesting is they're all getting smacked down by the court, and I suppose that should lend a degree of confidence to kind of the freedom movement. But for whatever reason, despite all these quite literally hundreds of victories against the forces of authoritarianism and government overreach, I'm still gobsmacked every time there's a victory in the courtroom. What we've seen, though, is we've seen, at least in the case of the federal government, a government that has at every single turn acted politically and unconstitutionally, whether it's the plastics ban that got overturned and then have the Liberals say, well, we don't really care about the court's decision or we don't agree with it, and then try to perhaps find some other mechanism to try to get at the ends the ends that they're looking for. Also, we've seen, this robust blocking of journalists on Twitter. We saw, an RCMP member slam David Menzies' head into a wall when he was just asking some questions. If you compare that to the treatment, I suppose, of Rebel News by the police in Switzerland during the WEF forum, it doesn't take a rocket scientist with more than a couple IQ points to rub together to understand that a lot of this stuff is politically motivated, and perhaps a lot of this stuff is just coming from the office of the PMO. Again, I'm a lawyer, and my opinion is mostly based on evidence, not necessarily anecdotal conclusions. But it seems like the writing to me is on the wall. By the time that the Emergency Measures Act was invocated, the blockades largely had been cleared. Freezing bank accounts of single mothers for sending $20 to, a GoFundMe or to a Bitcoin address. That smacks of Stalinism and fascism. It's absolutely unacceptable, and I think that the court's decision in this case really was a slap back at the government. Obviously, the first thing that the Liberals come out and say is that, well, they're going to appeal it. So I guess my optimism needs to be tempered to some degree, because we really need to see if they do, in fact, intend on appealing this decision, what an appellate panel at the federal court will rule. It's a lengthy decision. And I think it's a guarded decision. And one thing that I know about what they call first instance judges or justices, who are basically the first court to hear something, is really it's their job to try try to render a robust decision that can potentially have as limited avenues for appeal as possible. So it'll take some creative lawyering, I think, on the part of the Liberal government to try to overturn this decision.
Yeah. And I can see that. I haven't read the whole ruling yet, but I can see in certain cases this judge is writing knowing it would be appealed either way, so trying to write it defensively. Now, Keith, I want to ask you a question. This is the second time I've been surprised by a good news judgment. The first was in the province of Alberta, a case, if I recall, it was called Ingram. And it was a mixed bag, but that case challenged the legal authority for many of the public health orders. That there was a technical flaw, and therefore that the laws were outside the power, ultra vires, the government. So everything that was done in their name had no basis. That was an exciting ruling in itself, but it also caused a lot of particular cases, including one that I know Chad had, to be abandoned. The case against Chris Scott, the proprietor of the Whistle Stop Diner in Mirror, Alberta. So a lot of other cases had reverberations from this. Now, let me ask you, for example, Tamara Leach, and I think we're going to try and get Lawrence Greenspan on the live stream today, but if not her, but maybe comment on other cases. Is the invalidation of the Emergencies Act, will that change other prosecution or other litigation out there? I would imagine that those 200 or 300 people who had their bank accounts seized would now be in a position to sue the government. Are there people like Tamara Leach who are in defensive mode against a criminal prosecution? Are any of their situations changed? I know you're still digesting this law like the rest of us, but do you think this will have a ripple effect in other litigation?
I do.
Let me go to Keith first. I'll come right back to you, Chad. Go ahead, Keith.
The first thing, let me deal with the second question first. The Emergencies Act gave power to the federal government to use war measures against its own citizens. And the court has ruled that two things, that the federal government, the Trudeau Liberals, the Trudeau cabinet, did not follow the law and did not have the legal basis to invoke these war measures against its own citizens. And that in addition to that, the Trudeau cabinet violated Canadians' charter rights in a way that's not saved by Section 1, not demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So that means all of their actions were illegal, and it means within the act, there's a shield that the government can raise to protect itself against being sued when it invokes these war powers against its citizens. Because their actions have been struck down as illegal and a violation of the charter, the shield's gone too. And that means anybody who was harmed by the actions of the federal government through the invocation of the Emergencies Act, by the freezing of their bank accounts, the canceling of their credit cards, can now sue the federal government. But I want to issue a lawyer's caution. There's an argument that the limitation period runs from the date of the decision, which means they have 2 years from today. There's also a potential argument that it runs 2 years from the harm. So anybody who's in the situation that may be in a position to sue because they suffered harm needs to get legal advice and act before February 13th of 2024. So they've only got a couple of weeks.
Wow.
Just in case. I think the better argument is that the 2 years applies later, but out of abundance of caution, you don't want to have your case struck on the basis that you're out of time, so they should act quickly. Now, let me answer your first question. Despite rumors, I have not found a single person who was charged for their participation in any protest in Canada under the Emergencies Act. They were all charged under the Criminal Code or some municipal statute or like a bylaw or a provincial statute like the Traffic Safety Act for parking in a driving lane. The witnesses, the officials and police officers, we tested that theory at the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act in the fall of 2022. And the police officials said that they never used the Emergencies Act to charge anybody. All of the charges that were laid were under the Criminal Code or provincial statutes. So unlike Ingram, the decision in Alberta where all the health mandates were struck down, people were charged with violating those specific orders. Businesses were closed on the basis of the Ingram orders that were struck down. So there was an immediate, more than ripple, it was like a dam bursting effect legally on the Ingram case. This one's different because, to my knowledge and the evidence that I've seen to date, no one was charged under the Emergencies Act. All of the trials that are going on are on the basis of the criminal code and provincial statutes. So, but yes, people have the right to sue who have been harmed.
We're talking with Keith Wilson, lawyer for the trucker convoy itself. He was the interlocutor in Ottawa representing the truckers in a series of negotiations with the local police. We're also talking with Chad Williamson, a lawyer for the Coots 3, who was down there in the saloon for days. That was one of my favorite moves that Rebel News ever did, is dispatching a lawyer in Wrench. Keith, I'm going to talk about the second part of this. The first part was there was no national crisis. There was no insurrection, violence, uprising, invasion under the Emergencies Act definition, which I read. But the second is what you said, the violation of our charter rights. There is no pandemic exception in the charter. There is no convoy exception in the charter. And I'll take our viewers through those sections of the ruling where the judge talks about that. But Chad, let's go to you for a final thought on the ripple effect that this may have. Keith just said he's unaware of anyone who was prosecuted by virtue of the Emergencies Act. But how do you I think this changes the tone in the country. I think this normalizes the freedom movement, and it casts a shadow of doubt on the enforcers. I think during the pandemic, there was a false consciousness of unanimity. We all agree with this. Everyone supports this. 95% of people are getting the jab. All 5 political parties at the national leaders debate agree on this. You're a rogue, contrarian, skeptical conspiracy theorist if you disagree. I think today's ruling changes the mood in the entire country, and we're going to go to the CBC's coverage in a minute to see how they're handling this terrible day from their point of view. I think that if nothing else, this changes how Canadians look at things, and it couldn't happen at a worse time for Trudeau. The man has rock-bottom credibility, and this just hammers it home that the guy was a wicked liar who invoked the Emergencies Act for his own purposes, not for the law. What's your feeling about what this does to the world?
Well, again, so just to come full circle, Ezra, I mean, well, first of all, I'd just like to say how humbled I am every time I get to hear Keith expound, his wisdom from up in the snowy glaciers of Edmonton, Alberta, or if he's out in Ottawa from there. Keith has such a remarkable way of concisely wrapping complicated issues into a nice package that's digestible for a layman's audience, and that's absolutely critical. So, Keith, big thanks there. I echo his lawyer's concern. What we've seen in Alberta, Ezra, is as Keith had mentioned, we saw since the Ingram decision, we've seen a deluge of civil litigation crop up against the Alberta government for subjecting people to measures that have now deemed to be unlawful. What we saw in Ottawa with the freezing of bank accounts, especially for people who might not have a lot of money, especially when there's this disproportionality where we've got someone that contributed $20 and had their bank accounts frozen for the complicity of the banks. There might be liability, obviously, for the federal government for some of those maneuvers. But what struck me the most is watching row upon row of jackbooted police using batons against peaceful protesters, trampling people with riot horses, and clearing those streets in the method that they did. Frankly, I think that there could potentially be liability there anyway. But I think that this might add some more ammunition into the cartridge to fuel some of those potential civil claims. Obviously, people need to seek legal advice if they think that they have a claim that arises out of the use of the Emergency Measures Act. The one thing that I would like to say, Ezra, and you've got some more news about another Twitter win that you might be sharing with the Rebel viewership at some point. But again, what we're seeing is Trudeau's government dragged through the mud again and again by clever counsel and by a court that may have had enough of this government's propensity to act in an unlawful, unconstitutional, unreasonable, unjustified lacking transparency and a completely unintelligible fashion to keep people under the thumb of its ambit. And I don't know, maybe the tide is turning. I think Trudeau's days are numbered, to be honest with you. I'm not going to crystal ball gaze, but the distaste is palpable.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, I'm very grateful to both of you guys. You're busy lawyers with important work, and this came out so suddenly. It certainly caught me by surprise. And for you guys to bring your big smarts to bear so quickly for our viewers. Right now, we have about 8,000 people watching concurrently between the 4 platforms we're on. We have about 2,300 on YouTube. We have about 5,400 on Rumble, and we have more on Getter and Odyssey. So a lot of people listening to your wisdom. Of course, people will watch this on the replays also. So I think that you guys really are talking to a big audience of Canadians and others around the world who care about freedom and are relieved that our judicial system is still capable of holding powerful people to account. So Keith Wilson out there in Edmonton and Chad Williamson down there in the Calgary area, thanks to both of you. Keep fighting for freedom. I know you will, and I'll take to heart your admonition that if anyone was violated during the Emergencies Act, including financially, it behooves you to get legal advice quickly, because you may have only about 3 weeks left to file a lawsuit. So, in fact, you may even wish to contact the 2 lawyers on our screen now, Keith Wilson and Chad Williamson. Thanks, fellas. Keep up the great work.